The U.S. government is now paying more interest on its debt than it spends on its entire military, $970 billion every single year. Just the interest, not the debt itself. Think about your own situation for a moment. If you were suddenly forced to pay more money just to cover the bare minimum interest payments on your maxed out credit cards than you were spending on your actual living expenses, your housing, and your personal security combined, how long do you honestly think you could survive before facing total, unavoidable financial ruin? Sound familiar? This is exactly the catastrophic mathematical reality currently facing the United States of America today. And it is the absolute primary reason why billionaire investor, legendary hedge fund manager, and renowned financial historian Ray Dalio is urgently issuing his final, most critical warning to both the American public and the broader global financial community. We are currently standing dangerously at the absolute precipice of an unprecedented, monumental $38 trillion sovereign debt crisis that has already begun to fundamentally fracture the deeply entrenched economic foundations of the entire world. And if you are not actively, aggressively repositioning your personal wealth and restructuring your financial portfolio right now, you are inevitably going to be completely swept away in the most massive, devastating, and silent wealth transfer that is currently unfolding right before our very eyes. Now stop for a second. Think about what that actually means. It means that the long-standing, seemingly permanent era of American financial invincibility and unquestioned economic supremacy is mathematically, structurally, and decisively coming to a definitive end, driven by massive, unstoppable macroeconomic forces that simply cannot be reversed by trivial policy tweaks, temporary interest rate adjustments, or empty political promises made during election cycles. Let's walk through it. Ray Dalio, the brilliant founder of Bridgewater Associates, which remains the largest, most dominant, and historically most successful hedge fund in the entire history of global finance, has dedicated the vast majority of his professional career to meticulously analyzing the deeply embedded, recurring, and cyclical patterns of macroeconomic history, and his ultimate data-driven conclusion is both deeply alarming and completely inevitable. The United States has officially reached the highly dangerous, incredibly volatile terminal phase of the classic, inescapable long-term debt cycle. By painstakingly and rigorously analyzing over 500 years of detailed historical economic data, carefully tracking the spectacular rise and the eventual agonizing fall of the most dominant global empires and their respective reserve currencies, Dalio has successfully identified a perfectly predictable, relentlessly repeating structural template that strictly governs the ultimate destiny of every single financial superpower that has ever existed on the face of the earth. This is absolutely not a mere theoretical exercise or a speculative guessing game. It is a rigorously documented, mathematically proven historical certainty that we ignore at our own extreme financial peril. We have already watched this exact, precise paradigm shift vividly play out with the highly dominant Dutch Empire and the powerful Dutch guilder in the 17th and 18th centuries, which was subsequently followed by the massive rise and eventual collapse of the British Empire and the globally accepted pound sterling in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And now, today, we are collectively watching the exact same catastrophic terminal sequence rapidly unfold with the United States and the fundamentally flawed US dollar. The long-term debt cycle always strictly begins with a brand new, highly structured world order that is typically established immediately after a major world-altering global conflict, which naturally leads to an extended, deeply prosperous period of widespread global peace, rapid technological innovation, and highly productive debt building that actually generates real, tangible economic growth. This highly productive, beneficial debt serves to massively fuel critical infrastructure development, comprehensive educational advancements, and groundbreaking industrial innovation, ultimately creating a spectacularly dominant economic engine that eventually, inevitably establishes its own national fiat money as the absolute, unquestioned global reserve currency standard for the entire world. Because the entire rest of the interconnected global economy absolutely needs this specific reserve currency to seamlessly conduct critical international trade, purchase essential energy resources, and settle massive cross-border transactions. The dominant empire is effectively granted a truly exorbitant, unprecedented economic privilege. The unique, highly dangerous ability to continuously borrow massive, virtually unlimited amounts of money at artificially suppressed, incredibly low interest rates, simply because the global demand for its currency remains artificially high. For many consecutive decades, the United States has aggressively, relentlessly, and catastrophically abused this unique, exorbitant privilege, slowly but surely transitioning away from the type of productive debt that actually builds the underlying strength of the nation, and shifting entirely toward highly toxic, deeply unproductive debt that merely sustains rampant, unsustainable domestic consumption, heavily bloated, mathematically impossible entitlement programs, and incredibly costly, endless overseas military conflicts that drain the national treasury. The ultimate, unavoidable mathematical result of this decades-long spree of reckless fiscal irresponsibility is a truly staggering, mind-boggling $38 trillion national debt, a horrifying number so incredibly, incomprehensibly large that the average human brain completely struggles to accurately process its true, devastating economic implications for the future of the country. But here is the absolute, unyielding, impossible arithmetic that absolutely guarantees the spectacular collapse of this current financial paradigm. The national debt is currently growing exponentially faster than the underlying gross domestic product, simply meaning that the actual foundational economic engine of America can no longer organically generate anywhere near enough real productive income to even cover the basic carrying costs and interest obligations of its massive, suffocating liabilities. This deeply terrifying mathematical reality brings us directly back to that incredibly shocking, deeply alarming $970 billion annual interest payment that we discussed at the very beginning of this analysis. As global interest rates have finally aggressively normalized and rapidly risen from the deeply artificial, heavily manipulated zero-bound levels that dominated the past decade of reckless monetary policy, the actual tangible cost to properly service this monumental, terrifying mountain of sovereign debt has absolutely skyrocketed, rapidly creating a highly vicious, completely inescapable, and mathematically fatal debt spiral that is currently accelerating by the day. To simply pay this massive, completely unmanageable annual interest burden, the desperately over-leveraged federal government must continuously issue even more new debt into the market, which immediately increases the total outstanding principal balance, which in turn mathematically guarantees that future interest payments will be even larger, thereby creating a massive, terrifying financial black hole that steadily, relentlessly consumes an ever-growing, highly destructive percentage of the entire nation's total accumulated wealth and productive capacity. Now, here's what makes this genuinely alarming for every single citizen, investor, and hardworking individual currently holding their wealth within this deeply flawed system. In a normal, rational, properly functioning financial environment, when a significantly over-leveraged debtor simply cannot mathematically pay their legally binding obligations, they are eventually forced to officially default, declare bankruptcy, and completely restructure their unmanageable liabilities through a painful but necessary legal process. But a powerful, deeply entrenched sovereign nation that fully controls its own proprietary fiat printing press, exactly like the United States of America, essentially never officially defaults on its sovereign debt in the traditional, honest, and transparent sense of the word. Instead of admitting financial defeat and restructuring honestly, they always inevitably choose a far more insidious, deeply destructive, and highly dangerous path: the total, unrelenting monetization of the national debt through the aggressive, unchecked printing of newly created fiat currency. They simply order the central bank to print the trillions of new dollars they desperately need to continuously pay their massive outstanding debts, thereby artificially and aggressively expanding the total available money supply and deliberately, maliciously destroying the underlying purchasing power of the existing currency held by the general public. This highly destructive, deeply unethical process is the hidden, completely silent, and overwhelmingly regressive tax of systemic inflation, a deeply structural, heavily engineered financial mechanism perfectly designed to quietly steal accumulated wealth directly from the responsible, hard-working savers, the vulnerable middle class, and the fixed-income retirees, solely to repeatedly bail out the reckless, irresponsible, and completely unsustainable deficit spending of the bloated sovereign state. This is precisely what Ray Dalio's deeply researched, historically proven macroeconomic framework strongly predicts will happen at this highly volatile, extremely late stage of the long-term debt cycle. The desperately trapped government will inevitably, mathematically, be heavily forced to print countless trillions of entirely new, completely unbacked fiat dollars simply just to continuously monetize the exploding debt burden, strictly to prevent an immediate, catastrophic, and highly embarrassing outright default on their treasury bonds, which will systematically, relentlessly, and permanently erode the true, tangible purchasing power and underlying value of every single hard-earned dollar you currently hold in your traditional bank account, your standard retirement fund, your corporate pension, and your supposedly safe, highly conservative traditional savings vehicles. But here's where it gets truly dangerous. The entire rest of the highly interconnected, deeply observant global financial world is absolutely not blind to this horrifying mathematical reality. And they are not simply sitting back and waiting to be financially destroyed by the reckless actions of the American government. A massive, incredibly intense, and highly strategic silent capital war is already aggressively raging right now behind heavily closed doors, completely ignored, severely downplayed, or entirely misunderstood by the willfully ignorant, heavily biased mainstream financial media complex. Powerful global central banks, incredibly wealthy sovereign wealth funds, massive international institutional investors, and highly strategic geopolitical adversaries are currently quietly, methodically, but incredibly aggressively shifting their massive national reserves completely away from traditional U.S. Treasury holdings and deeply vulnerable dollar-denominated financial assets. They are carefully looking at the exact same 500 years of extensively documented historical data that Ray Dalio is meticulously looking at, and they absolutely, fundamentally recognize that voluntarily holding the heavily depreciating fiat debt of a mathematically, structurally insolvent empire is an absolute, mathematically guaranteed silent loss of massive proportions. This highly strategic, rapidly accelerating global shift is exactly why we are currently seeing truly unprecedented, absolutely record-breaking, and historically massive physical gold purchases aggressively executed by powerful central banks all around the entire world, particularly heavily concentrated in strategically aligned nations that are actively participating within the rapidly expanding, highly influential BRICS economic bloc. These deeply strategic, forward-thinking nations are aggressively, systematically dumping their highly vulnerable fiat dollars and rapidly replacing them with the ultimate, historically proven, deeply resilient, non-counterparty, purely foundational safe haven monetary asset, actual physical gold bullion. They are actively, urgently preparing for the completely inevitable, rapidly approaching macroeconomic paradigm shift, aggressively positioning themselves and their national economies to successfully survive the highly disruptive, deeply chaotic collapse of the U.S. dollar's long-standing, completely unipolar global dominance. This intense, rapidly accelerating silent capital war is the absolute, ultimate, most reliable, and deeply predictive leading indicator of a fundamentally changing world order, as intelligent, highly mobile global capital always instinctively, rapidly flees a structurally depreciating, heavily manipulated fiat currency in desperate search of a truly secure, globally recognized, and mathematically sound store of value. As this massive, truly global de-dollarization trend aggressively accelerates and continuously gains unstoppable momentum, the deeply vulnerable United States will rapidly, catastrophically lose its long-standing exorbitant privilege to endlessly borrow cheap money from the rest of the world. There will inevitably, mathematically, be significantly fewer foreign institutional buyers willing to purchase highly toxic American debt at artificially suppressed yields, which simply means that the deeply trapped Federal Reserve will be absolutely, unequivocally forced to aggressively step in as the ultimate desperate buyer of last resort, directly monetizing an even larger, more massive share of the exploding federal deficit, which will mathematically, undeniably only hyper-accelerate the highly destructive, completely inescapable inflationary death spiral that is currently destroying the middle class. According to Ray Dalio's incredibly exhaustive, mathematically rigorous, and historically verified research, when a deeply indebted sovereign nation finally inevitably reaches this highly critical, deeply unstable terminal juncture, there are strictly only three truly possible macroeconomic paths forward, and absolutely none of them involve a peaceful, easy return to the highly comfortable, deeply artificial financial reality of the past 40 years of declining interest rates. The very first potential path is a highly destructive, deeply chaotic, disorderly decline. In this absolute worst-case, deeply terrifying scenario, systemic inflation aggressively, violently spirals completely out of control as the deeply panicked Federal Reserve is desperately forced to print endless, truly incomprehensible trillions of highly depreciated fiat dollars simply to continuously monetize the exploding national debt, directly leading to a rapid, catastrophic, and deeply humiliating global collapse of basic confidence in the US dollar as a reliable mechanism of exchange. Massive foreign investors, deeply terrified global central banks, and highly aggressive sovereign wealth funds aggressively, indiscriminately dump their massive accumulated dollar holdings onto the open global market, instantly causing critical import prices to violently skyrocket, massively disrupting highly sensitive global supply chains, and completely permanently destroying the basic standard of living for the average hard-working American citizen. This highly chaotic, deeply destructive path is historically, consistently characterized by incredibly severe, deeply painful economic hardship, massive, completely unprecedented global wealth destruction, and incredibly intense, highly volatile internal political conflict as a deeply polarized, heavily fractured, and deeply angry society aggressively fights over a rapidly shrinking, highly depleted economic pie. The already massive wealth gap violently widens to truly extreme, completely unsustainable historical levels. Radical political populism aggressively surges on both the extreme far left and the extreme far right ends of the heavily fractured political spectrum, and the very foundational social fabric of the entire nation is severely, aggressively tested to its absolute, fundamental breaking point. This is unquestionably the most dangerous, highly explosive, and economically destructive potential outcome, and unfortunately it is a highly common, deeply tragic path that many completely failing, heavily over-leveraged historical empires have blindly walked down throughout the long, deeply repetitive history of human economic civilization. The second potential path is a highly orchestrated, deeply manipulative, and heavily controlled, managed transition. In this deeply insidious, highly restrictive scenario, the heavily indebted federal government and the deeply compromised Federal Reserve actively attempt to carefully engineer a highly slow, heavily controlled, and deeply agonizing burn of the massive national debt strictly through a prolonged, deeply painful, and highly restrictive period of structural financial repression. They aggressively, deliberately use heavy regulatory capture to artificially, structurally cap nominal interest rates significantly below the actual, true, heavily manipulated rate of systemic inflation, effectively forcing highly vulnerable domestic savers, conservative institutional bondholders, and deeply exposed pension funds to silently, completely unknowingly accept deeply negative real returns on their hard-earned capital for an agonizing decade or potentially even more. This highly deceptive, deeply unethical macroeconomic strategy is essentially a massive, highly coordinated stealth default where the strictly nominal face value of the massive sovereign debt is eventually technically paid back to the bondholders. But the actual tangible purchasing power of the heavily depreciated fiat money used to pay it is drastically, permanently, and maliciously reduced to a mere fraction of its original value. While this highly manipulative, deeply restrictive path technically avoids an immediate, highly visible, and catastrophic overnight financial implosion, it mathematically absolutely guarantees the incredibly long, deeply agonizing, and heavily depressing period of severe economic stagnation, heavily squeezed, deeply painful living standards, and the completely silent, systematic, and incredibly aggressive confiscation of generational wealth directly from the deeply vulnerable, highly exposed middle class. To enforce this highly restrictive regime, the desperate government will inevitably aggressively implement extremely strict, highly draconian capital controls, aggressively significantly increase burdensome taxation across the board, and aggressively utilize absolutely every single heavy-handed regulatory tool at its massive disposal to forcibly direct trapped domestic capital directly into highly toxic, deeply negative yielding government bonds, essentially deliberately trapping unaware citizens in a structurally depreciating, mathematically doomed asset class. The third possible path is a highly optimistic, deeply transformative period of complete structural renewal. But this is historically, statistically, the absolute rarest, most incredibly difficult, and deeply challenging macroeconomic outcome to successfully achieve in the real world. It absolutely fundamentally requires a truly monumental, completely unprecedented, and highly painful total restructuring of the entire deeply flawed American economy from the ground up. It strictly demands incredibly massive, deeply unpopular, and highly severe cuts to all discretionary and mandatory government spending, a complete, total, and fundamental overhaul of the heavily bloated, mathematically insolvent entitlement system, a highly disciplined, completely rigid return to structurally sound money principles, and a massive, truly unprecedented surge in genuine, completely debt-free, highly tangible economic productivity, massively driven by truly groundbreaking, highly disruptive technological innovations that fundamentally alter the global landscape. While we undeniably absolutely possess the incredible, highly advanced technological capacity for exactly such a deeply transformative structural renewal, the highly toxic, deeply fractured political reality of an incredibly divided, heavily polarized, and deeply partisan nation makes this highly optimistic path incredibly, statistically highly unlikely to ever actually materialize. Deeply compromised, highly self-interested politicians are structurally, inherently heavily incentivized to simply continue the incredibly reckless, highly destructive deficit spending and massive, relentless money printing strictly to continuously appease their highly dependent, deeply demanding voter bases, thereby making the incredibly hard, deeply painful, and structurally necessary choices required for a true fundamental structural renewal completely, absolutely, politically suicidal in the modern electoral system. Therefore, as intelligent, highly proactive, and deeply aware individual investors, we must absolutely, ruthlessly, and immediately prepare ourselves and our families for the highly probable, deeply disruptive reality of the first two paths, a deeply inflationary, highly volatile, incredibly restrictive, and economically destructive macroeconomic transition period as the deeply flawed, heavily manipulated old financial order completely breaks down and an entirely new, highly uncertain monetary system is slowly, painfully born from the ashes. This absolutely fundamentally means that absolutely everything you previously thought you knew about traditional, supposedly safe investments must be completely, radically, and immediately rethought from the ground up. The highly traditional, deeply revered 60/40 portfolio consisting strictly of conventional equities and government bonds, which has historically served passive investors so incredibly well during the deeply anomalous, highly artificial 4-decade era of continuously declining interest rates and supposedly stable fiat money, is right now an incredibly dangerous, highly toxic financial trap that will absolutely decimate your purchasing power. Holding massive amounts of pure, uninvested fiat cash is absolutely no longer a viable, highly conservative safe haven strategy. It is quite literally a rapidly melting ice cube, absolutely mathematically guaranteed to continuously lose significant tangible purchasing power every single day as the deeply trapped Federal Reserve continuously, relentlessly continues its highly destructive policy of structural currency debasement. Government treasury bonds, historically, traditionally viewed by the global financial establishment as the absolute, unquestioned, highly secure bedrock of any truly conservative, highly defensive investment portfolio, are right now quite literally certificates of mathematically guaranteed wealth confiscation, offering deeply suppressed, highly artificial yields that will absolutely, fundamentally never manage to keep pace with the actual, true, completely unmanipulated rate of systemic, deeply embedded inflation. To successfully, definitively protect your hard-earned wealth and aggressively, intelligently position yourself to not only merely survive, but actually massively thrive and heavily prosper during this truly unprecedented, highly disruptive global paradigm shift, you must absolutely, radically, and completely restructure your entire financial life right now, before the window of opportunity completely slams shut forever. You must aggressively, completely abandon the deeply flawed, highly dangerous illusion of permanent fiat currency stability and aggressively, proactively transition your vulnerable wealth directly into deeply resilient, highly tangible hard assets that simply cannot be printed, completely manipulated, heavily debased, or arbitrarily defaulted upon by a deeply desperate, heavily over-leveraged sovereign government. This absolutely fundamentally means intelligently, strategically allocating a highly significant, deeply meaningful portion of your overall investment portfolio directly to highly liquid, globally recognized physical gold and silver bullion, the absolute ultimate historically proven monetary insurance policies that have successfully, consistently survived the catastrophic, completely inevitable collapse of absolutely every single unbacked fiat currency system in the entire documented history of human civilization. It absolutely means aggressively, highly selectively acquiring top-tier, high-quality, heavily income-producing tangible real estate assets that will continuously, reliably appreciate in strictly nominal terms as the underlying fiat currency rapidly, aggressively depreciates in value while simultaneously, highly strategically allowing you to systematically pay down deeply locked, fixed-rate mortgage debt with significantly cheaper, heavily inflated, structurally debased future dollars. It strictly means intelligently, carefully investing your capital directly into highly robust, deeply dominant, heavily entrenched businesses that actually produce absolutely essential, highly demanded physical goods and critical services, directly possess massive, completely unassailable pricing power within their respective industries, and can successfully, seamlessly pass the violently surging, highly destructive input costs of systemic inflation directly onto the end consumer without losing significant market share. It absolutely fundamentally means deeply understanding, carefully researching, and actively acknowledging the rapidly emerging, highly disruptive macroeconomic role of deeply decentralized, entirely non-state, mathematically scarce digital assets that actively technologically offer a powerful, highly viable, and completely outside alternative to the deeply failing, heavily manipulated traditional fiat monetary system. And most importantly, above absolutely everything else, it fundamentally means actively, relentlessly developing a truly deep, completely unshakable, and highly analytical understanding of the massive, highly complex macroeconomic forces currently at play in the global system, so you are absolutely, unequivocally not completely blindsided, heavily devastated, or totally wiped out by the deeply inevitable, highly volatile financial shocks that will absolutely, relentlessly continue to aggressively rock the entire fragile global financial system in the coming years. The entire macroeconomic world is currently changing significantly faster, more aggressively, and far more fundamentally than at any prior point in our entire collective lifetimes, and the highly traditional, deeply conventional financial strategies and passive investment techniques that worked so incredibly well just yesterday will absolutely, catastrophically, and completely fail you tomorrow. You are currently, fortunately, part of a highly small, deeply informed, and incredibly aware minority of individuals that actually, truly understands the massive, truly existential scale of this highly terrifying $38 trillion sovereign debt crisis. And you currently possess a very brief, incredibly narrow, and rapidly closing window of truly monumental financial opportunity to take massive, deeply decisive, and highly protective action right now, long before the deeply distracted, completely unaware wider public finally agonizingly wakes up to the deeply horrifying mathematical reality of their massive, completely invisible financial losses. Do not simply sit back and lazily wait for the heavily biased, deeply compromised mainstream financial media to finally officially announce the total collapse of the current monetary system. By the time it is actually heavily broadcasted on the nightly evening news, the massive, unprecedented global wealth transfer will absolutely already be completely, permanently finished, and you will inevitably, tragically be left completely alone, hopelessly holding the deeply toxic, entirely worthless bag of a massively depreciated, fundamentally broken, and completely dead fiat currency. Subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of framework we break down on this channel. The next video covers specifically what the last 3 major economic transitions look like for ordinary people.